Welcome to the Wealth Horizon podcast, where we explore the latest trends, challenges, and opportunities shaping the financial industry today. In each episode, we bring you insightful conversations with industry leaders, sharing practical, actionable strategies to help advisors deepen relationships and meet growth goals. I hope you enjoy. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about how you see, because one of the things I love so much about your professional perspective is that you work with both firms and families. I know you work a lot with ultra high net worth families, and I'm certain that you talk a lot about what they're looking for in firms. I'd love to hear your thoughts on a firm's value proposition and how a family perceives certain things over another thing. I work with firms all the time to help them to define their value proposition. How do they define their value proposition in a way that sounds differentiating? We do a lot of work with that through storytelling and content, but I'm curious to know from the other side, how do families perceive the value of what a firm is offering, particularly pertaining to integrated service model and these sort of family office services?
Well, that, what you're referencing is I have had the pleasure over the last 5 years of taking families on, for lack of a better term, an escorted auction, taking them through the landscape, looking at their criteria and trying to match it against what that specific family's needs are, and then finding a match for them. I think the thing that primarily is driving families is that they feel that they would be an important client for that firm, that they can deliver on their specific needs, and that they have a staff with the prowess to do that, and that there is generally, in terms of the firm, an alignment of interest, where they have somebody that is their agent and advocate. So the first consideration that families are looking at, it's a primary one, it's inescapable that they look at it, is trying to understand who owns the firm. What are the owner's motivations? And are the owner's motivations align with my needs? The second consideration, of course, that they look at is the nature of the services that could be rendered. Do they have people on staff, and do they have a proof that they've done this for families like me? I don't want to be, for instance, their biggest client. Do they do this for other families like me? I earned my wealth in such and such a place, a business, a profession. Do they have clients like me? This gets into one of those things in the cautionary tale article. I think firms are commended to stick to their knitting and not just look to every client as being equal. I know it's part of the work you do, but what is their ideal client profile? And have they articulated what their ideal client profile is, which should be commensurate with their service model being able to render those solutions? Back to my point on pricing. What is the value rendered? Back to the point on value rendered, and I'm not sure I made it before. Value rendered not only is saying you can do something, but it's showing, not telling. And ways in which you do that, and this is your profession, Rosemary, is through stories, through testimonials, not through hollow assertions. And so families need to feel confident that they are in fact getting the solutions that they required. But also, this is one of these quotes in the cautionary tale article. In fact, I think I quoted Lynn Bourne from Aspirant, who very wisely stated, she's the head of practice management for a firm on the West Coast. Well, they're on the East Coast too, but primarily started on the West Coast, that the advisor has to have mojo. I mean, I know that's a silly term, but they also have to believe that they're doing good and have confidence that they understand because of their own prowess that they're doing good. So a lot of these things, I think, come in combination to be able to deliver at the firm level on the promise for families, but the promise of the firm isn't enough. Families are discerning, and they feel that that's a firm that can deliver on what they say they can deliver, and they have confidence that they are a fit. So a lot of fit at the end of the consideration of some of the searches I've done. Really, we stopped thinking of the objective criterion because there's not a bad firm that they're meeting. And it really gets down to this visceral, I feel something, I feel there's a fit. And the good news is, thankfully, that human component part is an inescapable part of why you select somebody. But that's after which there was a pretty rigorous objective process that unfolded.
I would love to get into when we talk about value proposition and we talk about messaging and we talk about what a firm says that it does versus what they actually do. I'd love to hear your perspective. And we sort of skirted on this earlier, but I want to revisit and what you think would be what are the dangers of overpromising family office services when the infrastructure does not exist to deliver the services?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to answer that in two parts. First, what the heck is family office services? And I have my own idea, but I want to frame that, and then let's talk about the implications at the firm level. Family office services really is this really variegated, the texture is really variable across a whole bunch of things. And they can be defined among the professional disciplines that I think, have historically looked at: investment planning, tax planning, legal planning, risk management, philanthropic design and planning. But there's a whole host of them. But I think family office services, as is being made as an assertion, we deliver family office services, is a bit of a barbell. On the one hand are what I regard as family counseling. And importantly, because of the great work that the Institute is doing and a whole host of great family counselors, we're learning that family counseling could mean providing legal and governance needs. It could require expertise in family systems and family dynamics. It could require helping the rising generation understand their role or roles. There are a host of family counseling requirements. The nature of how that is met and delivered varies widely between and among families, and importantly, in terms of the design staff models of many firms that state they provide family office services. We'll get to the economics in my second part of my answer. Separately in the barbell are some things that you and I would regard as being more prosaic, more fungible, more easy to deliver. And they come into this sort of area that I think of as data and information management, household financial management, and so on. Something as simple, it would seem, as bill paying, advanced bookkeeping, requirements to provide data throughput into a client portal and into populating an investment report, or separately, apart from the consolidated report, some form of budgeting and general ledger accounting. It is anything but easy to deliver on that straightforward requirement. But let's now look at the economics of those two elements that are barbelled. One, on family counseling, requires extremely advanced training and professional prowess. It is, with a few exceptions, today largely outsourced, and appropriately outsourced, to get the very best people to provide that level of counseling customized to that individual family's needs requires typically somebody on the outside. Firms are bringing people in to do that, yes, but largely I think that can be outsourced in terms of the economics. Now, separately, go to this more, I said it was simple or prosaic element of providing on data information management, including bill paying and advanced bookkeeping. There's no way firms can do that with any margin if they don't do it with great scale and, importantly, systems. And so for most of them today, they can deliver that They might deliver on it, but I can guarantee you they don't do it profitably, or they certainly don't do it at the same margin as the remainder of their business. So I believe both might be in the short term outsourced. I think you could embed the family office counseling role ultimately on staff. I don't see any way any firm can ever deliver on scale of doing bill paying, advanced bookkeeping, and data management internally unless they're really, really big. Maybe someday that will occur. So I think both of those barbell ideas that are roughly defined as family office services are margin eroding and in the short term should be outsourced.
Mm-hmm. And then there's and what it always makes me smile when firms put on their value proposition and their external messaging, this concierge services, right? So this concept of we will do anything for you at any time. And I've seen firms really talk about how they walk their clients' dogs and how they, they're there as the first call when grandmother gets locked out of her house or someone needs to find a private school for their children, or there's, they need to buy a plane and they have to find a plane, or they, there are this concept of concierge services, I think, that has entered into the marketplace for the first time in, maybe in the past 5 years, that have become a part of the family office service mix that people are, find more commonplace. And I'm like, do you really want to tell people that you walk their dogs? To me, it cheapens the services. And so I think that there's that too. I think firms are trying to be all things to all the people, and it's just a dangerous area.
Just because, again, it's one of my bugaboos. I don't like concierge services. I don't know what it is. It varies so widely. I think it's extremely hard to deliver on it. I think it actually puts you in a position potentially of under-delivering on whatever the expectation was, whether it's getting tickets or planning a family trip or the like kind. There are firms that do that. And I think, again, back to the diligence process, a firm should endeavor to identify firms that might be able to provide those level of services on a consistent basis at a high level of quality and outsource it to an adjacent partner. I don't think that's part of what was ever in the design of the wealth management promise when wealth management came into being. I think it's to the extreme. One of the things I think that's now entering into some firms, I don't see any firm doing it well. I know the economics of delivering it put the margin of the firm at peril.
Do you feel that outsourcing is a solution to the scope creep?
Well, interesting. Scope creep is to the degree that there are some things that need to be in the galaxy of what are straightforward services. You have to deliver them. They're a sine qua non. You deliver them. The question is, how do you add to those additional services other things that make your service promise additionally, incrementally better? But to some degree, you get to such extraneous requirements that families might be asking you to do that unless you have a form of compensation, pricing, that captures what are typically non-recurring, non-repeatable projects, you'll do all of those services at some loss of margin. And I think there's a easy fix to be able to pass along that project fee to a client as long as there's an open discussion on fees. An example, and it comes up actually quite a bit, that a family is contemplating doing something with private aviation among the many different variations that they might consider. Oh, we'll do that service for you. We'll investigate that for you. But if you just do that and aren't compensated for it, clearly they're asking you for it. You have access to presumptively good information. You can deliver that back to the client. You should be paid for that. So that falls into the category of a project and pass through that project cost. But there are some other things that are just really simply extraneous. I just don't think you should have the discipline as a firm to say we don't do that. And you might actually be in a position to say we not only don't do that, we can't recommend anybody because we haven't spent our time and attention and diligence in finding appropriate partners because we don't think it's been a really important need of our clients. And that might be good counsel for the family to hear.
Uh, that sort of leads to my next question for you. I'm curious to know, from your perspective of working with families, how do you feel the best way is to communicate your pricing model, right? So your how you charge based on retainer, based on complexity, based on assets under management. How can you communicate that without sounding transactional, and make and use it as a conversation to make a connection with a family?
Well, I think emerging. So first of all, I mean, I've made this perfectly clear in a couple of articles. I don't believe that the dependence on an asset-based pricing model alone will not and cannot work for families that are certainly centimillionaires and most of the ultra high net worth. So at 50 or $100 million, the fact is families won't pay you for what you are expecting on an asset-based fee. And really interesting, because I've done a lot of review of data, you'll find it really fascinating in item 5, which is fees, in the ADV form, ADV brochure, where firms disclose their fees. Most firms don't disclose their fees above $100 million. And when they do, they often say it's negotiable. Well, the reality is it's not particularly negotiable, because they really don't have pricing power to deliver on that with an asset-based fee. And so again, back to this notion that the defense, the prophylactic for that, is to charge fees for the value rendered away from the investment or asset management piece. And to do that on a building blocks basis, so there's transparency around what the inputs, what the requirement was, what the firm's inputs are in terms of their staff time and effort, and what in fact the value rendered would be for that non-investment service. And to do that in conjunction typically with an asset-based fee is emerging, I think, as the best practice. You can get an asset-based fee probably up until a certain amount, and you can deliver a non-asset-based, essentially fee-for-service negotiated model for non-investment services. Last point. Clients, however, will pay you for assets under management and investment performance for private investments. The presumption is, in the private investment arena, you are accepting some form of illiquidity. There is a presumption that it could be generating alpha, hopefully alpha after fees and taxes, and therefore some people would be willing to pay for that. Now, pricing power still exists for firms that can deliver on that promise. So I don't want to just say nobody has pricing power above $100 million. Firms that can deliver on private investments above $100 million will have pricing power, and many have used not only an advisory fee, but they tack on an option of a performance fee in addition to the advisory fee. So I want to make sure it's clear that there could be pricing power above $100 million for investments, but it's primarily in the private investment area.
I think that's really interesting. And I think because the independent space has grown so, it's so attached to this idea of, there's no conflicts. There are no products. They are not selling anything. I think that the waters get to be a little bit murkier when you think about other revenue streams and how people are getting paid and compensated. And I think it's important to be really clear about it. But it's really hard to talk about that. And I think a lot of firms struggle with that message, how to communicate, how you're charging clients without it being transactional, and how to be competitive, right? And still do what they need to do.
I think it is tricky. It's clearly tricky, the question of it being transactional. We know, and it's somewhat, famous, that we know a lot of clients that choose not to call their advisors because they have a billable rate. And that has been the undoing of some really great legal advice, that the client literally shy to re-engage with that professional advisor just simply because of the billable hour. Many law firms, because of that, have gone to project fees, have gone to exactly what I'm recommending, that there is a negotiated fee for service based on the expected inputs, time and effort being the primary driver of that. And so there's a way in which you can get to the same solution, but it doesn't feel like, geez, they're going to pay me if I just pick up the phone and call them. And I think that relates to what we as an industry, need to regard as a fair system, that a fee for service based on full transparency of what will be delivered is a best practice. I don't want to single them out, but I'm going to, only because I know they do it. But a firm like Pathstone, one of the leading firms in the industry, has a matrix of services. I have looked at it recently. I don't know how many services are on that matrix, but it's in the hundreds. So they have at least a roadmap around which they can apply a methodology to the stated client criteria, the stated client needs, and then rationalizing that against what they're going to have to deliver. And they can compute the negotiated fee based on what the stated inputs will be. So that at least there's an emerging methodology around that. Pathstone is not alone. I don't want to mention other firms here, but I think that's going to emerge as a practice, so that then there for the client on a building blocks basis is this transparency that I'm asking for this, and that's what the cost of it will be. I don't think that's transactional.
I think that that's a best practice. And yet so many firms are hesitant to do that, right? Create a matrix. I don't know why.
Well, I think any firms that have perhaps less confidence that they're not delivering the value rendered, or are concerned that the family just won't pay, will balk. My lesson, remember, I was a client-facing guy once, many years ago, but my lesson from the field is really price-sensitive clients are not good clients. And they may not be ready for the nature of what our industry can provide them. And I know it's not always easy, but they would be at the indication where they're signaling price sensitivity. They might not be an ideal client.
I think that's a good point. I want to sort of switch gears a little bit and talk about things that this is something that I encounter a lot, very frequently, with the companies that we work with. There is an inherent risk, sort of a key man risk, that a lot of firms are facing as the founders become more ready for retirement. There is this consideration of what are the next steps. I'm curious to know, firms really want to highlight their deep bench. They want to highlight their strength and all of their talent. How can leaders talk about their team and their culture and their founding story in a way that will balance the need for a multi-generational solution for families with the next generation of leadership within the family? I'm curious to know your thoughts on what do families look for in a firm who might be seeking a multi-generational solution.
Well, back to the example of the searches that I've led families on. Right at the outset, we get into the issue of who owns the firm. Immediately following that, of course, is what's the nature of the retirement schedule for senior individuals I often ask, over a 5-year period, and what's the plan to essentially sustain the firm. But the issue of sustainability comes up. And it is a fair question to the degree that the industry remains largely a first-generation industry, and that includes many, or frankly, almost all RIAs until very recently, and most, but not all, of the non-depository trust companies. I think commercial banks and broker-dealer firms are a little different. In regard to that first-generation firm, the individuals that are my age, I have a birthday next month, I'll be, heaven forbid, 72, but there are many people that are my age, and they have, it's not a rule of thumb, but they have delayed in doing enough of an internal, I don't believe this is a word in our lexicon, an internal equitization of their other staff members. They've been slow to do an internal transition of equity. And because we've had valuations of firms, multiple expansion occurring over the last almost now 15 years, because of the multiple expansion firms that are closely held, concentrated ownership, it's become very expensive to, in fact, take those key people out of the equation with sufficient time to do an internal transition. And therefore, there has been a significant number of capital sponsors that have entered the space to help with succession. Many have entered, by the way, the space to help with growth, and they're strategic investors, but many are financial investors who are taking out individuals through the tail end of their careers. But in combination with that concentration of ownership also comes the key man risk that clients are dependent on that generation of advisors and owners. Often they're the same people. Those firms are particularly at risk. The perception that families have is that they are not built for a intergenerational transfer and won't be sustainable unless there is some other capital partner, sometimes a control capital partner, at which point there may not be the ability of the firm to essentially continue to drive the bus. So I think planning for some firms has happened. Some, unfortunately, has not happened. And I think families see risk that the firm's values, vision, and value rendered is, in fact, not sustainable. So, at this point, given your audience, all of those firms that are looking at their ownership structure today in the current model, hopefully they've endeavored to understand what are the drivers, the determinants of their enterprise value, and they've begun to do something for an earlier transition of internal ownership than it being left to, basically left to too late, where they've run out of time and have no choice but to find a capital partner to do the transition of the ownership.
And I'm curious to know your thoughts on how and how public a firm should be with that messaging. Do you feel like it's beneficial for a firm to be very public about the fact that they are planning for succession and sustainability, or do you feel that that's risky because then people will sort of think that an owner is on his way out before or her way out before it's actually time? Like, I know a lot of firms kind of struggle with the balance of when to sort of start that messaging, how public, how big should the message be? I'm curious to know your thoughts on like those kind of specific questions.
Well, my first reaction is there's enough firms out there that are proud of being independent. And I think we have some examples of firms that have become fairly big and remain independent. So it's not as if it can't happen, and it could happen. I guess most famously, Rob Francis and the team at Esperiant are a large independent firm that I think will remain in that definition. And you have to commend them for that. There's a lot of planning that went into that to put them in a position to do that. It happened when Rob and some of his colleagues were quite young. So good for them. But most firms are not in that category. And many firms claim that they're independent and really don't have any capital. Remember, almost all of these are partnerships. Most are organized as LLCs. All they have is free cash flow, to which it needs to be distributed at the end of the year, either as a profits distribution or reinvested back in the business, one or the other. And therefore, there is no treasury or capital. They have to have a capital partner to the degree that they're going to do some form of transition. And I think it would behoove all people to make the claim that we have the following capital transition plan. There's nothing wrong with that. And it might require them to have an investment from a minority investor to allow them to move through that transition so that they can be more sustainably independent. But, it's quite stunning to me that firms have been late to doing this transition, and many are sellers today because they have no choice, and there's plenty of buyers. And so I think we see lots of firms who will, in fact, give up on the promise of their independence in favor of what are the shareholders, the owners, and they'll sell. But there's enough firms that are truly virtuous, that are trying to balance their independence between the rights and duties to their capital source, the rights and duties to their clients, and importantly, what's right for their employees. And so there's enough of them. I think there's an emerging group that's fairly large, and I would definitely commend them to, before being asked, because clients that I work with, families are asking, to make it clear what is their ownership structure and what is their plan for sustainability.
And I'm kind of getting into sort of some specific, what would you do in this situation questions. But I feel like a lot of people really want to know your opinion on this stuff. Tell me a little bit of how do you think a firm should communicate their growth strategies? Like if a firm is aggressively pursuing growth, if they are in M&A, if they are growing aggressively, what is the best way to communicate the growth intentions to their audience without taking still putting the emphasis on where it needs to be, which is the service of the clients, on the personal relationships? How can because I have a lot of firms who I work with that will be ready to release a press release about either a merger or an acquisition, and then they sort of hold back and they think, I really don't want to do that. I don't want to scare away my current clients. How can they communicate that growth and that path towards scaling their companies and then ultimately perhaps taking on a capital partner? How can they communicate that to their clients in a way that will be beneficial and relationship building and enhancing?
Well, in any M&A transaction, and I mean, there's not some middle ground. It is either of a strategic nature or it is of a financial nature. The motivations, meaning they're one or the other. And so there's plenty of firms that should be advertising, sharing that they did a merger because they believe it will, on an integrated basis, be better for their clients. They will add a geography, they'll add a team of individuals, a special group of people with special prowess. Maybe there's some technology systems that they can integrate with the acquired firm. By the way, some firms don't talk about acquisitions, they talk about mergers. I mean, and I know we're spinning here, but it's in the spirit that there is the ability for the firm that's being added to be part of the whole and be a better part. 1 + 1 = more than 2 is the underlying notion. And so mergers are not necessarily bad. And if they deliver better solutions for your clients, why wouldn't you lead with that? If, however, they're purely transactions that are financial, they are effectively getting more assets around which they can advise on, and the presumption is they have better economic outcomes. That's a completely different motivation. And one of the things that firms have to be mindful of is their duty to clients, but importantly, their duty to employees. And when the nature of the firm is changing because of the financial transaction alone being the motivation, you put at risk both employees and clients.
I totally agree. Okay, well, Jamie, we are coming up to the end of our conversation, and I have a couple more questions for you. If you have one piece of advice for an advisor considering moving into the ultra high net worth centimillionaire segment of the market, what would that piece of advice be?
I think they need to be professionally motivated to learn. They need to recognize where their strengths are, what they do really well, actually what they like doing. And they also need to recognize what it is that they might not do as well or what is a weakness. And rather than correcting that, find individuals that can support them to deliver on that. And so what does that mean? It means that they have to recognize that to deliver this integration requires others to be with them in the journey with that family. And then inherently, I've said it before, it's not just integration, it's they have to be collaborative. I think there's a lot of compensation systems that mitigate against collaboration, and it's for firms to decide what they want in terms of their compensation. But largely, there are individuals that aspire to serve greater wealth. They have to be collaborative. Now, curiously, collaboration is, it could be partly intrinsic, but collaboration is a skill, and it's something that they can be better at. They can learn to be more collaborative. But I think the orientation of the client has to be collaborative, and therefore I think they're motivated by learning, and the ability to adapt skills as a better collaborator is what they need to be able to do. Because everyone has essentially an original discipline, their first discipline. They have to be equally aware of and knowledgeable of other disciplines. They may not need to be an expert at that, but the ability to be aware of those other areas that are not their strengths and at least improve on their knowledge of those is certainly something they have to do. But then they have to be in a position to bring other people that touch their client and be in a position to not be threatened by outside professional advisors that are touching their client, so they can deliver the integrated solution. So I think the main thing is they just need to have to be both in their nature, team players, part of an ensemble delivery, but also willing to be more collaborative. And if it's a skill that they can be better at and they can learn, they should endeavor to be more collaborative through some formal program, whether it's executive coaching, training and development, or for the younger generation, some mentoring.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you. Okay, I have a curveball for you. Sort of a curve, not really a curveball. For you, it'll be really easy. What is your favorite podcast right now?
Oh, isn't that interesting?
What are you listening to?
Well, my podcast appetites run pretty wide. I love history, but I don't want to go there. I want to just offer a sort of a thought on podcast. I just think Ted Seides' Capital Allocators is exceptional. Hmm. I don't self-identify as an investment professional. I'm a business consultant. I started in the business in the investment area, but I was always behind. I always felt I was not strong in that area. And I've had to learn as much as I could about investment management. I had to learn about investment vehicles, structures. I had to learn about various asset classes. I've had to really go deep on the emergence of private assets as a class, private equity, private credit, hedge funds, real estate, a whole host of illiquid investments. I've had to learn that. I learned more from the Ted Seides Capital Allocators podcast than any other. The other one that I'm a fan of is what Joe Riley has done in the last 3 or 4 years, something like that. Joe is an incredible interlocutor. I think he's actually found his career calling. He gets great guests. He does a lot of homework, and he asks incredible questions that are not softballs. They're not edgy either, but they just get behind the obvious and go deeper. So those would be the two that I would highlight.
I knew you were going to say Joe's podcast. I had a feeling you were going to say that. Well, Jamie, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I really appreciate it. As always, I really enjoyed our conversation. I would love to tell everyone how they can get in touch with you should they just want to ask you more and learn a little bit more about what you do.
Gee, I am always open. Love to hear from people. My website is jhmclaughlin.com, and that largely is my domain. And so my email is jamie@jhmclaughlin.com.
And I will also just mention that we will put a link to the cautionary tale article that you penned. We will put that in the show notes so anyone can click the link and access that article along with the rest of your thought leadership.
Rosemary, I might say that people need to start paying attention to Rosemary Denney's podcast.
I thank you for that, Jamie. Thank you.
You're welcome.